Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
American foreign policy has had two tests recently, two big tests. In the Philippines, we apparently passed. The jury's still out on Nicaragua. Today on Public Affairs Roundtable, we're going to look at American foreign policy, its applications in various places, including the Philippines and Nicaragua. Where are we headed? Panelists on today's program are Bruce Galehood from the Department of History here at Ball State University, George Pilcher, also from Ball State's Department of History, and John Rouse from the Department of Political Science. Did we, in fact, do well in the Philippines, and are we, in fact, struggling in Nicaragua? Is there a comparison there at all, Bruce?
I don't think that there's a comparison necessarily, Larry, but I do believe that what happened in the Philippines is notable in terms of the flow of American foreign policy, particularly recently. I think that with the Aquino government instantly almost recognized by the Reagan administration and the movement away from support of Marcos, it was very clear that the United States had probably for the first time severed its almost absolute support of a right-wing government in that sense, which, however anti-communist it may have appeared to be, nevertheless had lost the support of its people, and there was an accommodation made with the forces of reform, and in the Philippines, and we're seeing the results of that. And I think perhaps that's a significant element in terms of the Reagan foreign policy, that there was a break with the past. We're not supporting like a Batista as opposed to a Castro situation in Cuba of a generation ago, and we paid the price for that, I suspect, to a certain extent, in the support of the Cuban people. And you could cite other instances of American support of right-wing governments in the past. Vietnam would be one situation. Another situation certainly would be the Shah in Iran and so forth. The Reagan administration made a break with that past, and I think in a rather graceful way.
We had a relative, hands-off position in the Philippines, in that we didn't want to stick our nose too far into their business. Basically, let our position be known, but let basically the people's will be heard there.
Right.
Are we going to find that same sort of policy carried out throughout, or was the Philippines a special case?
Philippines, it seems to me, was a special case. We're discussing Nicaragua, in a sense, as the next foreign policy challenge for the Reagan administration. Those seem to be two separately different issues here. We're talking about to what extent should or should not the United States support the counter-revolutionary group in Nicaragua, as opposed to, which is not part of the government, as opposed to being involved in the situation in the Philippines where there really was a contest for power. And almost there was, in a sense, a peaceful revolution that took place in the Philippines. There's not going to be a peaceful revolution, as near as we can tell, going on in Nicaragua, unless, for some reason or another, the Sandinista government chooses at some point to negotiate the situation that they face in their country relative to the Contras. So they do seem to me to be two different situations. It's interesting that one of our senators, Senator Lough from Indiana, is a key player in terms of the process in both cases, as an observer in the Philippines, the Philippine elections, and then counseling the Reagan administration upon his return of the necessity, I think, to move away from the Marcos regime and to establish some sort of accommodation with the Aquino group. And now also as chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, hearing being a critical part of the debate which is going to take place and will take place about Nicaragua and the degree of support which the United States will or will not give to the Contras.
Is the $100 million we're talking about proposed for Nicaragua, John Rouse, is that a symbol? It's really not significant in terms of winning a war, winning a revolution, rebelling against the government, is it? Isn't it pretty much a symbol of whether the United States is going to become involved militarily or quasi-militarily in these kinds of civil wars?
I think the die is already cast. The process of confrontation is already there. This country has made the mistake, in a sense, of supporting a right-wing dictatorship for many, many years, even involving our own troops in Nicaragua. I think, unfortunately, the die is already cast, and the conflict is coming. the issue is how does our country deal with the conflict? It seems to me that it's a very comprehensive issue that the American people and the American politicians have yet to deal with. We can deal with much more narrow issues. To answer your question, yes, it is a symbol. I think the aid will go forth from this country in terms of the Congress passing the legislation. The issue in the past, we've dealt in a very ideological kind of way with these kinds of developments. This is a revolution of the people we're dealing with. We really have to look at these issues, not just Nicaragua, in different kinds of ways.
Nicaragua, I call it a civil war. You talked about a revolution of the people. The president's talking about the spread of communism worldwide, particularly in Central America, on our doorstep, less than a day's drive from wherever. Are we talking about a sphere of influence here where we want to have more influence in our backyard, George Pilcher?
I think President Reagan has always had a capacity for overacting, and I think he demonstrates that a bit in his hyperbole addressed to this particular issue. Certainly we need to be concerned about the types of governments in our backyard, wherever our backyard is, and I suspect that's pretty much a global backyard. I also suspect that the American people have arrived at a point, however, where they are not content to support bad guys in our backyard. I'm not sure the American people know who the bad guys are in this particular situation. They don't want our government to be on the side of those bad guys. It is highly possible that the Sandinistas are bad guys. It is highly possible that the Contras are bad guys in the minds of the American people. The fact that whatever else they might be, the Contras might be anti-communist, whatever that means, I suspect is not going to satisfy the American people. I think we see the beginnings of this dissatisfaction in the great divisions which exist in Congress on this issue today. The fact that we are engaged in such an important debate over a mere $100 million means that, however symbolic that might be, it's becoming an important question in American politics. We have learned that when these issues divide the American people, the American government cannot handle the issue very well.
Okay, there are no guys in white hats here. But what we have is apparently a pro-communist and anti-communist two sides. And it's the American position always has been to side with the anti-communists, right?
Well, there are bad guys and there are their bad guys. And it has for a long time been the American habit to support our bad guys. I'm not sure the American people are going to stand for that anymore.
George has raised an interesting point. Maybe you'd like to pursue it a little bit farther. You talk about some division, ambivalence here, among the American people about the proper position to take on this. How well informed do you think we are at this point?
I think the American people are probably ill-informed about the issue. I, however, do not believe that makes them wrong. Mm-hmm. I believe that sort of an upwelling of idealism on the part of the American people. That's been going on for 20 years, I believe, mm-hmm. and that can't be resisted. And that doesn't depend upon accurate information.
Mm-hmm.
If you compare the Philippines to Nicaragua and Latin America, I don't think this is a very good comparison. The Philippines at one time were a part of our own country. They were a colony of the United States. There was so much communication between opposition leaders and people in this country, whereas the communication channels between the countries of Latin America and this country have been one way. Essentially, we have told them we're going to do it this way, and that's it. It seems, again, that our foreign policy making, not only for a place like Nicaragua, but also Colombia, Mexico, Panama, Venezuela, Argentina, Brazil, Peru, especially Mexico. I mean, these kinds of revolutions, these kinds of people, kinds of concerns are going to be coming to these places as well. The issue is not so much how we deal with Nicaragua, but how we deal with a whole host of these kinds of concerns. And are we going to deal with these kinds of issues in pat ideological kind of ways that we've done so in the past? We didn't do very well in South Vietnam. We didn't do very well in Iran. It seems that our domestic policy and our foreign policy is at a crucial point at this stage. Am I overreacting, you think, Bruce or George, on this?
Well, I believe that government policy inevitably represents the will of the people over the long term. It cannot function effectively, certainly in the United States, without the general support of the American public. I think that was proved in Vietnam. I'm not sure that was proved in Iran, where we just made perhaps a variety of technical miscalculations about what was going to happen. I don't really look upon the Philippine situation today as having a whole lot to do with how the United States or the people in the United States, or perhaps even the government in the United States, felt about the issue. I think we were in a great position to make bad things happen in the Philippines, and we chose not to make those bad things happen. But I don't think we can arrogantly take credit for the good things happening there. I think that being the case, we have to focus on Nicaragua as really a kind of issue divorced from many of these others. Perhaps all these issues have to be seen discreetly.
Okay, the Nicaraguas, the Sandinistas have been pictured, painted by the American right as the Stalinist Sandinistas in pursuit of their Marxist-Leninist objectives. But certainly the Sandinistas themselves have said they're carrying on a revolution without borders. George Will says, okay, forget Nicaragua for a minute, give that to the Sandinistas. What then if they go into Costa Rica? A country without a defense, a country that is democratic. Do the American people feel differently?
I doubt if the American people have thought about it, but I would
well, don't you have to think about that?
Well, I think maybe they have to, but I would argue at this point that if the administration now would take severe and very costly steps to shore up the anti-communist defenses of those neighboring countries, that would be well received by the American people, because it would be seen as reinforcing an essentially democratic situation.
You're talking about Honduras, Costa Rica?
Honduras, Costa Rica.
Perhaps Guatemala and even El Salvador?
Sure, certainly.
One thing that has come out in a lot of the debate about this, and I think this is something all of us can discuss here, is the problem that, and this was seen in the Democratic response the other night to the President's speech, that implicit in the opposition, or the criticism, shall we say, of the President's approach was, we don't want to be dragged into another Vietnam. We don't want to have a situation develop where we make a small first steps which become larger and larger, and ultimately we're trapped in a situation that doesn't seem to have any resolution and doesn't seem to have any graceful way of getting out. It just continues to get worse. I don't know that that's quite accurate here in this particular situation. I think as a people, and certainly as a political and a military leadership, we've learned some things from Vietnam. And Nicaragua is not 8,000 miles away. Nicaragua is in this hemisphere. That doesn't mean that necessarily we should respond in an interventionist way, but it means that a different set of circumstances apply to the situation. Because we intervened in Vietnam and it was such a costly, devastating national tragedy, does not necessarily mean that we should look with disfavor upon the use of force at some point down the road if our interests are imperiled in some way. And by that, what I'm really referring to would be the kind of situation where Mexico was destabilized and we were looking at severe interruptions in the flow of oil or something like that. Now, that's not going to happen tomorrow and probably won't happen next year. George's comment about shoring up the democratic regimes in the area may make a lot of sense from that perspective. But I think we can make the mistake of trying to misapply the lessons of history, and I'm not sure that the Vietnam lesson is one that necessarily is one that would apply here in the situation in Nicaragua. A piecemeal approach here in Nicaragua might not necessarily lead to American involvement in Central America.
It would certainly be interesting to think about what it would be like having Ronald Reagan as president with Vietnam on your hands, but then you're talking about Central America.
That's right.
He did not hesitate to go into Grenada. Somewhat of a similar situation, obviously something we could handle quite easily. But is not Ronald Reagan the man who would quite likely get us involved if he saw any threat whatsoever to get military involvement?
Let me just clarify that point a little bit too, because I don't think it makes any difference perhaps because of Vietnam, whether it's Ronald Reagan, whether it's a Republican, or whether it's a Democrat, any president now who in the future commits American forces, Grenada probably isn't the best example of that because we really were down there to at the request of some Americans who were there, and as things turned out, they were glad we came, supposedly, these medical students. But any American president who uses American troops in an interventionist, forceful way probably won't do so without strong congressional backing, a sense that the operation, whatever it's going to be, will be successful and will not be of long duration.
That's what they thought about Vietnam, wasn't it?
No, that's not, well, true to a certain extent. But once again, I think that lesson's been learned. And a Central American-style Vietnam, the only way it seems to me to compare, in a sense, is that you have kind of guerrilla forces instead of regular armies, large-scale regular armies. But in this case, even the guerrilla warfare kind of capability is the sort of thing which is being done with the guerrillas almost being on our side, as opposed to the Vietnam situation where they weren't. And I think the Vietnam experience was so harsh and so telling in the United States that any American president is just going to have to think very, very. It's going to have to be very clear.
You say we'll go in with our eyes open this time.
Absolutely, and it won't be a long, drawn-out, piecemeal kind of approach. The forces will be sufficient, we would think, or we would hope, to accomplish the mission that they were set out to do.
If I could ask my colleagues a couple of questions by the way of a statement. It seems coming out of the Vietnam experience, there was lack of clarity in terms of what the objective was in Vietnam, and also the real issue of sacrifice.
Sure.
I mean, I would think at some point in time, in terms of our values, whatever our values are, that young men in America, keeping in mind that old men send young men to war, the old men never send old men to war, that young men will have to die for the values of America as they did for South Korea during the Korean conflict, as they did for Japan and also West Germany in World War II. The question for us in this country and also here in Indiana, of course, is what are young men going to die for in terms of the sacrifice? The second kind of thinking in terms of clarity is that Reagan has not made his positions or the clear and present danger positions why we should send more money to Nicaragua until the administration makes clear the clear and present danger of Nicaragua, and also asking ourselves, what do we want to sacrifice for? Until these issues are answered, we're going to have confusion on these kinds of things, are we not?
Very much so. I think that one lesson of the Vietnam War that we can't forget is that those things are fought here at home. They're fought in Muncie, Indiana. They are fought as fully and as completely in Muncie, Indiana as they are in the rice paddies or the plantation fields of some foreign country. And if we're fighting that war at home, we cannot fight it effectively someplace else. I think that we would all agree with that. That is a lesson which has to carry over.
Another point about what you were saying too, John, is the objectives were not clear, and in some respects I think I would differ with that a little bit. I think Lyndon Johnson and certainly Kennedy and Eisenhower were talking about their objective of preventing South Vietnam from falling to the communists. Now that was done from the standpoint of that's important because if South Vietnam falls, you know, the dominoes would continue to fall, and that would ultimately threaten American security because of our interest in the Pacific and so forth. Now the problem with that was that those objectives were explained, but as the war went on, those objectives were not supported. I think President Reagan is in something of a similar situation right now. He has said that American national security is involved in Central America with the Nicaraguan situation. You perhaps recall the map and the use of the graphics to show how the Nicaraguans allegedly were undermining neighboring regimes and also regimes in South America, how the bases which were being established in Nicaragua were bases that the Russians were putting in place and so forth, and actually making the statement that American national security was involved here. Now, to get back to the point, I think the question as to whether or not that objective clearly stated, it could be understood, but it may or may not be supported in the long run. And that, I think, is what the president ultimately has to be involved in first of all, persuading Congress of the validity of that particular point of view, and then also the general public as well, at large. Whether that happens, of course, is another matter. So,
Is not foreign policy now the issue of the mid-late 80s? We seem to have domestic problems under control to an extent, and that the deficit's not really a worry as long as interest rates are low. And hasn't this really put an additional focus on foreign policy, that Ronald Reagan has a real challenge here to steer a steady course?
Sure. Not only in Nicaragua, but also in the Middle East, in South Africa. The negotiations for arms control, it's almost, there are pockets of foreign policy problems wherever he looks.
Yeah, see, I don't think you can separate foreign policy from domestic policy, especially when it comes to the use of resources like oil. I mean, Egypt is in real turmoil now. South Africa has a lot of minerals that we use, of course. So, Larry, I'm not sure that you can separate foreign policy from domestic policy. I mean, we're having a nice go right now because of the oil rates going down and interest rates going down, but there's no guarantee that this is going to be like that forever. So how we deal with the issues of race in South Africa, or how we deal with indigenous revolutions where people want more say in their lives in Latin America, is very key for how we live at home.
Perhaps we're talking about the perceptions of voters, the political perceptions involved and I think there is a very clear line in the perception of voters between foreign policy and domestic policy. At this point, I don't think there are any real concerns among voters that Reagan should be thrown out because of some bankrupt domestic policy. They might have real objections, however, to what they perceive as his foreign policy.
I think you're absolutely correct on that. But, I mean, the American people have not looked beyond the Atlantic and the Gulf and the Pacific, whereas the Europeans are very closely tied to the foreign policies.
You're saying the American people really don't care about foreign policy?
I'm saying they're going to begin to care more in the future. And there's going to be less distinction between foreign policy and domestic policies, because America is becoming less of a fortress island, just as Japan is, which is a much more extreme illustration. The U.S. is shrinking in terms of its impact and influence in the world, and we're going to have to think more in an international realm and less in more isolated kinds of ways.
As we move toward 88, will Ronald Reagan have less influence as the chief executive in terms of foreign policy? Are we going to be looking at the posturing of Democratic and Republican candidates for president then in 87 and 88?
I think it's a matter of, can the conservative do the liberal thing? The person in Indiana who's come out on top, especially with the Philippine illustration, of course, is Senator Lough, who is chair of the Foreign Relations Committee. That really brings the Indiana connection in. So it's an issue of how politicians, especially conservatives, as they're called conservatives at least, deal with liberal kinds of concerns involving these kinds of issues.
I don't get the sense, and I'd appreciate George's comment on this too, I don't get the sense that Congress is treating Ronald Reagan as a lame duck on the issue of Nicaragua, though. And I don't think he's acting as a lame duck. Speeches to the public, this speech having to do with Nicaragua was almost reminiscent of the first tax cut speeches and speeches of that kind, were appeals to the public at large over the head of the people in Congress who may be opposed to him, that sort of thing, trying to rally people to this position. I don't think he's acting as a lame duck in that capacity. And secondly, he may be a lame duck in terms of some rather thorny domestic issues, especially after this next election, takes place in the fall. But I think in foreign policy, a president has a tremendous degree of latitude. Eisenhower, the last 2 years that he was in office, for example, intervened in Lebanon, almost intervened in the Taiwan Straits crises, was involved in a considerable range of foreign policy operations in Latin America during the last year of his presidency. And so a president does have much more latitude in terms of his behavior and his powers, if you will, in the foreign policy field than he would in terms of domestic policy. So I don't look for Reagan to slacken off on these issues at all. Domestic policy may be something else.
George?
Well, I'm truly impressed with Ronald Reagan's ability not to suffer from lame duckery at this point, and his ability to deal effectively with Congress. He seems to have outlined a process of overstating his case, which always gives him wiggle room, plenty of chances to compromise. Congress seems to like that because often does not put them in a spot. The only thing that bothers me about this particular issue is the extent to which he might have put them so much on the defensive with his harsh language.
Mm-hmm. I think what the president has done in the sense of maintaining his influence is that, first of all, he has a great deal to do with raising the agenda. Oftentimes, others on the outside of the White House raise the agenda. Reagan does very well at keeping the agenda in terms of he raises the agenda. In terms of those agendas, he talks in an ideological kind of way, but the reason for his success, or my perception thereof, is that he comes forth with pragmatic solutions. And so I think just how successful he is on this issue, in a sense, he is calling for the money, he's calling for force, but he will have others in the Republican Party who can emphasize other kinds of ways of dealing with the issue. So it's still a very dynamic kind of problem. And if he deals with the dynamics, not trying to control the dynamics, but dealing in a pragmatic kind of way.
We're out of time. Thank you, gentlemen, for your commentary today. George Pilcher, Bruce Galehood, John Rouse. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for being with us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana, 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Cecil Bohannon and Bill Mosier. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science, and radio and television stations on the campus of Ball State University in Muncie, Indiana.